Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you very much, Jasper, for inviting me to this, and especially to the director of ICPAC for extending this invitation to this very important webinar. As many of you may be aware, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is the custodian of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, supporting member states, regional economic communities, partners and stakeholders to effectively implement the Sendai framework. The Sendai framework was the first to be adopted among the post-2015 international frameworks and agreements, coming therefore before the SDGs and even the Paris Agreement for climate action. The SDGs therefore made reference to the Sendai framework and recognized it as a tool for resilience and a bridge towards attainment of the SDGs. With its four well thought through priorities for action, the Sendai framework calls for prevention of new and reduction of existing disaster risks through the implementation of an integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political, and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disasters, thus increasing preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthening resilience. I was invited to talk a bit on how the Sendai framework supports this, SDG 2 on food security. And I think I want to say that we all know disaster risk reduction cuts across different sectors of development. Indeed, there are about 25 targets of the SDG that are related to disaster risk reduction in 10 of the 17 SDGs. This firmly establishing the role of disaster risk reduction as a core strategy for development. In East Africa, like in many countries in Africa, natural hazards are a cause of food insecurity and hunger, particularly when they compound existing economic vulnerability. Large shocks and extensive risks destroy agricultural assets and infrastructure, causing serious damage to livelihoods and food security of millions of small-scale farmers, pastoralists, fishermen, and in many developing countries in the region. Often people depend on agriculture. I think we all know that East Africa is an agrarian economy. So people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, and they face increased exposure to disaster risk, which trap them in a cycle of food insecurity and poverty. The high impact of disaster and climate on agriculture calls for enhanced mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation strategies within the agricultural sector. Looking at the SDG 2, one realizes that target 2.4 is the most relevant to disaster and climate change. And this target calls for ensuring sustainable food production systems and implementing resilient agricultural practices that increases productivity and production, that help maintain ecosystem, that strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, drought, flooding, and other disasters, and that progressively improve land and soil quality. This target, if you look at it critically, supports the immediate need to advance actions in mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into agricultural sector planning and investments in order to promote resilient livelihoods, food production, and resilient ecosystems. In the context of the Sendai framework, the relevant actions would include strengthening productive assets such as livestock, working animals, tools, and seeds. Agricultural practices also need to be modified in order to adapt to the projected changes in climate conditions, as well as increasing disaster risk. We can also, we need sustainable and productive agriculture systems, including farm technologies and practices such as crop diversification to adjust to new temperatures and precipitation patterns. We need changing livestock breeding practices and shifting grazing patterns. We need developing and managing of climate resilient food production systems. We need developing and using drought and food tolerant crop varieties and adapting water and soil moisture conservation measures, which are just but a few examples of what we can do to help prevent, mitigate, and reduce disaster and climate risk. As we aspire to attain food security in East Africa, we must understand, the basic question is, we must understand how climate and disaster risk can threaten the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 2 on zero hunger. We know that disasters often lead to household and community assets loss and livelihoods at disruption, potentially triggering negative coping mechanisms, undermining resilience. Recurring disasters from all causes and climate change impacts drive also generational poverty. We also know that climate change and hazards events can exacerbate the multidimensional poverty by impacting on people's health and well-being, damaging ecosystem, infrastructure, and food systems, and is disrupting economic activities, both in education, healthcare, and also other service provisions. We also know that climate change is contributing to degradation of the ecosystems and changes in seasonal weather patterns, undermining agriculture, pastoral and fisheries production, livelihoods, and food security. And we also know that disaster and climate change impacts affect people's health and well-being and damages food production assets. We should therefore be able to identify, we should not only, it is not enough, what I mean here is not enough really to understand the threats to the attainment of the SDG 2. I think it is also important that we should be able to identify risk generated by developmental practices. This is because blind pursuit of SDG can generate climate and disaster risks as well. If laws, if policies and practices supporting agriculture, husbandry, fishery, forestry do not consider disaster risk and projected climate change impacts, they are risking promoting maladaptive practices, degrading ecosystems, introducing new hazards, and exacerbating existing risk. In other words, it is good to ask ourselves, are the laws, policies, programs that support agricultural production, forestry, fisheries, are they sensitive to disaster and climate change and the needs of farmers, the needs of fishermen, the needs of vendors, the needs of vendors, traders, all those who are at high risk areas? Then after discussing that, then you ask ourselves, then what is it that we can be able to do? Can we be able to use the tools that we have at our disposal to address this problem of food insecurity?